It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Deven Kane from Chicago, joining us all the way from Chicago. He will be talking about women personified as the nation or as liberty on coins.
Thank you, everybody. So the inspiration for this talk originally given a version of this to the Chicago Coin Club for Women's History Month. Ever since we started representing beings in art, even deities in art, humans moved very quickly into human personifications of divinities. And obviously, once it comes to coins, you started seeing eventually gods and goddesses on coins, particularly in the Western world, in Greek coins. And eventually, you got this concept of the city goddess, which embodied the city. So the first one I will start with is a rather extreme case of it, because Athena is obviously not just a city goddess. She's the patron goddess of Athens, but she was also one of the major Olympian deities. And she's obviously, Athena shows up on coins of other Greek coins as well, particularly Corinth. But this sort of does tie in. Athena is a female deity. She was the personification of Athens. The coins over here are the three particular variants of the tetradrachms of Athens, starting with the really archaic version. In the middle is the classic version. And in the last decades of Athenian coinage, you have what is the new style version. But as I said, Athena is not really the ideal personification of what I'm going to talk about today, but she sort of falls in the picture. Now, personification, obviously, before I go ahead, it doesn't have to be female. There are obviously male personifications as well. Particularly in the United States, we got Uncle Sam. With Britain, you have John Bull. There are countries where the personification of the country is, particularly in recent years, is male. But more often than not, in the ancient world, it was often depicted in a female form. And the greatest example of this is Roma, who was basically the civic goddess who symbolized Rome. And so this is a coin from the Roman Republic. It's an early denarius. Roman Republican coinage, once they moved to silver, well, it was considered impolite to put living beings on it until, with a couple of exceptions, until Julius Caesar did it. And having Roma depicted on the coins was very, very common. As she personified Rome. Now on the reverse, you have Nike in a chariot with wings. Nike is going to show up on some of these coins in the presentation. And obviously the wings on Nike also are, along with the wings on Cupid, sort of apply to later imagery, particularly of angels on coins. But in the Roman world, Rome, obviously Roma, a female deity, this is a very big start to this personification of a woman as your city, as your state. And this carries over into this period in Roman history called the Social War. Because what had happened is Rome by now controlled the Mediterranean. It had used a lot of allies, soldiers from Italian allies to conquer much of the Mediterranean. But a lot of these Italian city-states were not given full Roman citizenship. And so around 90 to 88 BC, a bunch of them demanded citizenship, and the Roman Senate, not wanting to give them citizenship, refused. And so you had the Social War, where a bunch of city-states revolted against Rome. And they issued these coins. It's a fairly scarce series of coins. I pulled this version of CNG, where now you're not depicting Rome, you're depicting Italia. And the name is written in Austin, value, and that again, Italia is depicted as a female deity facing left, and the reverse is you have a soldier standing holding a spear. Now, as it turned out, this war in retrospect was fought for nothing, because Rome basically won the war by giving the Italians who had not revolted citizenship, and eventually the Italians who had revolted all got citizenship anyway. So, but we get another depiction of regions, geographical regions on coins. And possibly the greatest example of this comes from the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who famously went around traveling like a tourist across his empire and then issued a bunch of coins, which we refer to as Hadrian's Travel series. And I'll show some examples over here. Over here again, we are seeing Italia on the reverse, standing straight. The second one shows Hispania. Hadrian and Trajan were both of Spanish origin, a Roman Italian family settled in Spain. Pay attention to Hispania. She's going to show up again centuries later. The next one, oh, by the way, if the coin images are too small and zoom, you have the option of zooming in, pinching in, and zooming. So you should be able to focus on any coins you want. The next one is Germania. There were a couple of provinces along the Rhine frontier, Germania Superior, Germania Inferior. The next one again is somebody we're going to meet again, Britannia. And the next one is Gaul, where you have the emperor facing a female representation of Gaul in a kneeling posture. And it goes on. You have, this one is a little more controversial given what Hadrian ended up doing to the place. This is Hadrian with Judea. Hadrian's reign marked the second Jewish revolt, and it was followed by him expelling all the Jews from Palestine and then renaming Jerusalem after his family name and trying to build a major Roman temple there. But you have the emperor clearly on the left with Judea. Hadrian famously was a Hellenophile, the first Roman emperor to wear a beard in the Greek fashion. And here he is restoring Achaia. This marks his famous visit to Athens. And again, Athens is the supplicant in here. Another one is Africa, again in the female form, reclined. You have a lion in the reverse. Asia here refers to what is now Western Turkey. And then this was later known as Asia Minor, as the whole peninsula was known. Anatolia was referred to that. And the next one is, I believe, Dacia, which was conquered by Trajan. And you'll see another representation of Dacia coming up, but this is actually still in a female form. Egypt, however, is special. Augustus had conquered Egypt. He made it an imperial province. Egypt gets not one, not two, but three representations here. One of them is actually male. So as I said, they're not always female, but most of them are. The first one is Egypt, female form. She's holding up a mirror. Egypt was a very rich province. It supplied the grain that fed the grain dole for the mob in Rome. And on the right, you have the city of Alexandria. And in the middle, you have Nilus for the Nile. But Nilus was a male god. So I struggle with calling this part of the travel series. It's often listed there, but Nilus shows up on coins of other emperors as well. But that one is a male one. And this is another male exception, Mauritania, where you actually have a soldier carrying javelins. Mauritania supplied a lot of Roman auxiliary cavalry. The Roman army famously was known for its infantry arm at this period. So they relied on auxiliaries to beef up their cavalry arm. And you have a soldier facing right with the spears. Now, Hadrian, again, in spite of what he did to Judea, these are fairly benign depictions of provinces in the female form. But Rome was not particularly a benign empire. This is a quote, suppose in Tacitus by a British chieftain who referred to the Roman method of conquest. They make a desert and call it peace. And Rome went around, conquered. They were not particularly popular in a lot of the places they conquered. And having conquered those regions, they like to boast about it. And with a coin image depicting the region they conquered. Now, over here, not all these depictions are human. So the first two come from Augustus, who after conquering Egypt and the death of Cleopatra and Antony represents Egypt with a crocodile. And then Armenia, which is a bone of contention with Parthia and later the Persian Sassanids, you have as a bull. The most famous one of these is, of course, Vespasian's Judea Capta coins. where you have the emperor on the obverse, you have a soldier, and at the right, you have Judea represented by a weeping Jewish woman. So it's a more disturbing image. And again, Jerusalem was sacked, the temple was burned down. And it was a pretty brutal war. And this is where Vespasian really made his reputation. So he's boasting about it. But again, the representations are not always female, because in this Judea capta coin, the weeping Jewish woman has accompanied by a Jewish male with his hands tied behind his back. And then the more common depictions for Romans over captives, and this actually continued on way past this period, is the generic reverse with the captured captives. You have a female and a male one. This is a coin of Titus. And then Vespasian's other son, Domitian, issued this fairly rare type for Germania. We have a female form of Germania in captivity. Nobody really knows what campaign this was issued for. Domitian did spend a lot of time with the army and warring on the frontiers, particularly in Dacia, which is modern Romania. But his campaigns in Dacia were inconclusive, but he did issue this particular type with Germania. And of course, then there is Trajan, who made the last major expansion, permanent expansion of the Roman Empire by conquering Dacia. Here, this is not a female representation, and it is actually a Dacian soldier, and you can see the shield and the spears, again, depicting Dacia as far as personification goes. So, as I said, Roma still represented Rome, the city goddess. Eventually, Roman citizenship would be extended to all living free individuals in the empire. But gradually, the depictions of Roma sort of, let's call it became politically incorrect. And these coins are issued in around 330 to 350 AD. And the big problem here was the Roman Empire was now going Christian. So you really cannot start depicting your state as a goddess at this point. We have not got back to later stages when you are in love with the classics and making these depictions. The first coin is the Urbs Roma coin, where these are more like civic issues. You don't actually name the emperor. You have Roma on the obverse, and then you have Romulus and Remus on the reverse. The middle coin is a silver issue, a Siliqua. And the one on the right is actually quite interesting, because this is Constantinople issued as the new Rome, which was a Christian Rome, which is now being depicted in the form of a city goddess, again in a female form. And if you look at the reverse, you can see the Cairo on the reverse. So these depictions start becoming a little uncomfortable. They don't entirely die out. They still show up on reverses of coins into the next century. But gradually, this dies out, because the empire is Christian. You're going to see more Christian depictions on it. And Roma is, well, it's passé. So this talked about depictions as the nation and depictions as liberty. And later we will tie those two concepts together. So let's get into the concept of depictions of liberty. The Greeks had their own depiction of conception of personification of liberty. Doesn't show up that often, but it's called Eleutheria. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. This is a fairly rare coin. I pulled a description and the coin image off CNG. And you can actually see the word Eleutheria written below the seated image, right above the tunny fish. The tunny fish is a giveaway that this is a coin of Mysia, but it is believed this was an issue around the time of Alexander, and it commemorates Alexander coming in to liberate the Greeks from the Persians. Maybe at least the cataloger believed this was around the time of the Battle of the Granicus. Now, how liberated the Greeks felt once the Macedonians went ahead and basically occupied them is a different story. But at this point, this is what the propaganda is set. But the more common depiction we have is the Roman concept of libertas, or which is the root of our modern word liberty. And again, Roman denarii in the Republican period often had Roma on the obverse, and these coins were issued by moneyers who basically every year they had a choice of deciding what they wanted on the coins. And so often they would choose liberty. And pay attention to the first one, particularly to the little hat behind her. We're going to have a particular slide dedicated to those caps. And those of you who collect American coins may notice a similarity to a particular American coin, which will also show up in the presentation later. So Libertas is the personification of liberty and shows up very often on the obverse of these coins in the Republican period. Obviously, when it becomes an empire, you have the emperor's face showing up on the obverse. But the big example of this is going to show up in the aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar. The assassins called themselves the Liberators, the ones who killed the dictator. And the top two are coins of Marcus Junius Brutus. We'll have another coin showing up with this portrait later as well. Again, you have Libertas on the obverse, and on the right, on the second one, you have the lictors who represent order in the Roman state, carrying their staves. Pay attention to that depiction too, because that's going to show up with our personification of liberty as well. And the second one with his co-conspirator, Cassius. Again, you have Libertas showing up on the obverse of both of these images. And these are propaganda pieces, basically. The Romans were great at using their coinage for propaganda to send a particular message all the way down until the late imperial period. Because these guys said they stood for liberty. Of course, in reality, they were oligarchs. When they said they said liberty to be ruled by people like them, which obviously limited their support and probably contributed to their eventual defeat. On the other side, you had the second triumvirate, and I didn't see any coins with them embracing liberty, which is kind of hard to do because among the things they did was have proscriptions where they killed a lot of people to raise money. But they did issue this coin in Greece with Eleutheria on it. And we know this because the legend is sort of off on this coin, but they spell out Eleutheria. And this is actually a joint issue of Mark Antony and Octavian. And Octavian is here as Gaius Caesar. Libertas makes another big appearance in Roman coinage in the aftermath of the death of Nero. When Nero died, you had what was called the Year of the Four Emperors. And it started with this particular rare coin, which imitates a coin issued by Brutus. I believe there are only 5 known. I got this off the CNG site as an example. And these are unusual coins for the imperial period because they imitate the style of the Republican period. And again, you have the personification of liberty in the female form on these coins. But having done that, the 4 emperors who ruled, they all wanted to say they were liberators because guess what? We came after the tyrant before us. The first one is the coin of Galba, this emperor right after Nero. And pay attention to the way liberty is depicted on the reverse, because this particular motif is going to show up very often. You have liberty standing with a scepter and she's holding a cap. And this is a good way to realize that this is actually a female depiction of liberty. We're going to skip over the next emperor, Otho, for a while, but the next emperor, Vitellius, did the same thing, as did Vespasian, who is the guy who finally finished the war and ended the Year of the Four Emperors. And he actually, if you have traveled in Europe, he lives on, his name has been associated with paid public toilets because of the methods he used to raise money to fix his budget deficit. In Roman Egypt, which had its own coinage with a lot of Greek influences, Galba issued a coin with Eleutheria, as I said, the Greek personification of liberty, as did Otho, the second emperor. I didn't find a liberty example to use on the previous slide, but I found this. Otho is the one who actually assassinated Galba and then committed suicide after he lost to Vitellius, and then Vitellius would eventually be murdered as Vespasian took over. So again, these are all propaganda pieces. You're using the personification of liberty for propaganda. But you have a problem. The empire increasingly becomes a military dictatorship. And this really starts getting home when the Emperor Septimius Severus dies, and he tells his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, to be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. Well, that didn't work. 10 months later, Caracalla assassinated his brother. Caracalla doesn't get the bad rap he probably deserves in public consciousness, but he's probably the most vicious sociopath to ever rule the Roman Empire. And it's kind of funny to see him, given the tens of thousands of people he put to death, put liberty on the reverse. And again, look at the motif. You have female liberty holding the scepter with cap. And liberty still shows up sporadically over the next century. You have, there's a coin of Trebonianus Gallus, who was not particularly vicious, but he was basically there because the army wanted him there. A coin of the Emperor Gallienus, whose great achievement was losing 2/3 of the empire and issuing a bunch of coins with a bunch of animals, which we call Gallienus's zoo. And then the emperor who came after him, Claudius Gothicus, all of them are putting liberty on the coins. And it's really becoming a farce at this point because the Senate has no role pretty much in selecting the emperor. These are all, basically if the army likes you, they're going to proclaim you emperor. Claudius Gothicus also has a unique distinction as being one of the only emperors in this 40-year period to die naturally, though he died of the plague. But he didn't die with a knife in his back. But with the empire basically a dictatorship, Libertas sort of starts dying out. This is again a super rare coin of a very obscure emperor we call Julian of Pannonia, where you have liberty. And again, instead of a staff, liberty is now holding a cornucopia, which is also a very common depiction of liberty. And about the last couple of them that I found also came from usurping emperors. These were brothers, Magnentius and his brother Decentius. Magnentius murdered Constans, one of the sons of Constantine the Great, and then made his brother co-emperor, and then was defeated and killed by the last surviving son of Constantine, Constantius II. But here as propaganda pieces, because he came up as a usurper, he puts liberty on his coins. And liberty is here tied up with victory. And you know it's victory because of those two wings behind her back. And this is something, a motif that goes on and gets carried on much later as well. But with these two, I think, as far as I can tell, these are among the last depictions of liberty, libertas on a Roman coin. And after this, basically, this concept sort of goes into hibernation. The concept of liberty doesn't die, particularly in Italy, which was known for its republic city-states after the fall of the Carolingian Empire, and particularly after the Holy Roman Empire broke up. A lot of coins made propaganda depictions on it, but medieval coinage was not particularly great at depicting human figures. And so most of the city-states, if they were smart, either had like a stick figure of the ruler or like had something very obscure. You're not trying to put any personification on it. But you really see liberty wake up when you get to the American Revolution, where the United States made a conscious decision to put Lady Liberty on the coin. One of the choices evidently was Columbia, but they chose liberty. And remember, I told you about pay attention to the liberty image of the cap behind her head. Most of you guys probably know a lot more about American coins than I do. It's not really my focus, but the first time I saw this coin, it almost looked like a ribbon. It later dawned on me, wait, that's a liberty cap. And pay attention to the liberty cap half dollar below. And the nature is a little different, and we'll talk about that shortly. And just going a quick run through American coins, you see the various depictions of liberty on American coins, the standing liberty, the barber, the trade dollar, Morgan, and the peace dollar. I'm assuming most of the people here know these coins very well, so I'm not going to spend too much on it. But I did want to spend a time talking about what I personally think is the most, and I think many people think is the most beautiful American coin, the St. Gordon's. I've noticed this recently in an article. I understand the Irish have claimed the model of Lady Liberty for themselves, but evidently St. Gordon's modeled this on his depiction of the Sherman Monument in New York. And the model, the victory he used in the Sherman Monument was derived from the Nike of Samothrace. But the model he used was this African American model called Hetty Anderson. And evidently recent diary notes have discovered that she actually appears to have been the model for the St. Gordon's dollar, which would also then make her the first African American woman to be depicted on an American coin, which I thought was quite interesting. Now I understand there is an alternative theory about the depiction being Irish. So I will leave it to the experts on it, but I thought this was kind of cool. A quick detour on caps. I've been bringing that up a few times. So this cap, this is a coin of Mysia. This is what was called a pileus. It was depicted on a coin of Brutus. This is one of the most iconic ancient coins ever, the Ide Mar Denarius of Brutus. And you can see the cap. This was what the Romans called a liberty cap, because it was supposedly given to freed slaves. And this was the cap they wore that marked their freedom. And this is the liberty cap that we use in our cap, in one of our first coins. This, on the other hand, is what is called the Phrygian cap. This is a coin of Pontus. The figure on the obverse is the Greek hero Perseus. But if you look at the cap, it sort of has, it goes up and then has a little bit of a tongue coming forward. And this is the liberty cap on our 1834 dollar. So what happened? Why is, these caps are obviously not the same. What happened? Personally, and I think a lot of people will blame the French, because they seem to have got confused with this in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And somewhere along the line, the Phrygian cap confusingly got associated with liberty, even though there is really nothing tying the Phrygian cap to liberty in ancient sources. But that became a liberty cap, and that is probably what most people think of the liberty cap today, even though that was erroneous. The three coins here are both in the first decade after the French Revolution. If you look at the year there, the new French Republic came up with its own calendar, which had other great innovations like having a 10-day work week, which means the peasants only got one day off in 10 instead of 1 day off in 7, which did not make it very popular. But you're also seeing a consistent depiction of liberty in the female form, and again with the Phrygian cap. And the French, and this is where I'd talked of depictions of liberty as the nation, and I mean, women, the nation depicted in the female form and liberty depicted in the female form. But in the age of revolutions, this concept sort of merges, because these new republics are overthrowing the monarchy, and the new republic itself symbolizes liberty. And so these concepts sort of start getting fused. And ultimately in the image of Marianne, who is the French personification of the liberty and the personification of the French personification of liberty. This is the most famous painting depiction of it. This is a painting by Eugene Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People. It's actually not from the famous French Revolution. This is actually from the 1830 Revolution, which led to the Orleans monarchy, and King Louis Philippe didn't want to give his people ideas, so he locked up the painting for the next 18 years. But Marianne shows up a lot on French coins. Both of these are from the early 20th century. 20 francs, the gold is from before World War I, the silver is from after World War I. The one at the bottom left is, again, I'm going to use the word iconic, the sword, which some people believe inspired our own Walking Liberty half dollar. And again, Marianne is wearing a liberty cap. And these are later depictions. I kind of like this one. The Phrygian cap almost looks like with the wings attached, it almost reminds me of like a pilot's cap over here, the way it looks. And this is a more recent depiction of Marianne on coins. Interestingly enough, the French, we moved those, liberty, equality, and fraternity, another iconic series of French coins where you have liberty on the left. If you look at it, you see the liberty cap and the scepter, and you see equality represented by the scales of justice, and fraternity. These first two coins come from the First Republic, from the period of the directory and the consulate. And then they show up again during the Second Republic, where the obverse legend has changed to liberty, equality, fraternity. Shows up again during the Paris Commune, during the Third Republic, and also fairly recently during the Fifth Republic in the 1970s. A very popular depiction of liberty on French coins that continues today. When the French went into Italy, they started spreading the concept of liberty across the board. They replaced a bunch of Italian city-states with puppet republics. The first one is from the Roman Republic. Liberty is standing again with a bunch of fasces, which at that until Mussolini and Hitler didn't have the negative connotation they do today. They were used to symbolize order. The next three come from the Subalpine Republic, which is what the French instituted in what the region of Piedmont, from the Kingdom of Piedmont, where the king fled to Sardinia. And again, if you look at the coin on the right on the top row, liberty is along with equality because she's holding the scales of justice. The next two come from the Ligurian Republic. This came from when the French ended the Republic of Genoa, which was an oligarchic republic, so not particularly free. Again, the second coin has equality with her. This one is from the Venetian Republic. Again, Napoleon ended the long Republic of Venice, which had lasted almost 1,000 years. And again, liberty standing with the fasces, and again, with the liberty cap, with the pole. The Neapolitan Republic, similar standing motif. And the last two are the Cisalpine Republic, which covered with the capital at Milan in what is now Lombardy. And if you look at the coin at the bottom left, you have the French Republic treating the Cisalpine Republic, which is like its quote unquote sister republic, almost like a supplicant. The French, funnily enough, took their depiction into the colonies, which I find amusing because the French rule in Indochina was not particularly benign. But this is, of course, the famous French piastre from Indochina. And the seated liberty here looks a lot like our Statue of Liberty, which is not surprising given the French is the other one who created it. The next is the next version of the piastre in the 1930s, and now she's wearing the Phrygian quote unquote liberty cap. And the last one is, at this point, this is post-World War II, and this is a piastre that doesn't have much silver, and the French came in. It's kind of ironic because the Vietnamese did not want the French back in there at this point, but they still issued these coins anyway. The aftermath of the French Revolution, you had the whole series of rebellions in Latin America where all these colonies went independent. And the next four coins are an interesting segue to start with one country that kept getting chopped up. So first is the Republic of Gran Colombia, which was Simon Bolivar's grand dream to unite Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia into one country, and which had fallen apart just before his death. And this is a more crude depiction of artistry, and it's also a more Latin American version of liberty. But by 1849, you have the Republic of Nueva Granada, which Venezuela and Ecuador have broken away, and it's a more classical, something you will see more in Europe. And the next one sort of cracked me up because liberty is looking very mean and pissed off over here. And I like to joke that this is now the Republic of Colombia because Teddy Roosevelt has broken up Panama. So Colombia has lost even more territory, so they have good reason to be pissed off. And 50 years later, she's still very pissed off. They still look mean. More depictions. These two come from Peru. You have a standing liberty, very common motif again here, standing with the liberty cap. And the later one is from the 1930s, seated with the pole. This one is Chile, 19th century. Ecuador, this is similar to our half dollars from the 1830s. And Mexico has a whole series of coins with just the liberty cap, but I found these issued during the French invasion of Mexico. These are provincial issues, and where the Mexicans have particular reason to talk about liberty during the rebellion when Juarez was fighting against Maximilian. But one of the funny things I saw when I was doing this presentation, when I was compiling these slides, and there are a lot of coin pictures in this, is when you get to the latter part of the 19th century, liberty starts looking very French, like how Marianne is depicted on French coins. So the first one is Chile. The next one is Argentina. You have Venezuela, and you have, I believe, Ecuador. And the reason for this is simple. These coins were being made by French engravers. You can see the name Udine on the ones for Argentina, Bar for the coins of Venezuela and Ecuador. You can see that engraver's name. And this is something that happened to when North Korea was making statues as a source of revenue and putting up statues in Africa. The Africans started complaining, hey, wait, these guys look Korean. And I think this is something similar. That's what's happening here. And as a more extreme case is the nation of Liberia, which was a haven for freed slaves. And I'd actually forgotten to put this slide when I'd done this previously. And then I saw this coin in Steve Album's auction a couple of weeks ago. And I'm like, duh. And these coins were issued, these are the first series of Liberian coins. There are two sets in 1847 and 1862, except the engraver was English. And again, this is a very classical Liberty Cap Marianne depiction. And then they had a whole series of coin in the 1890s. This is a full set going from 1 cent, 2 cents, a dime, 25 cents, 50 cents. And the last series are actually minted in Birmingham, United Kingdom. And again, you are seeing, this doesn't look like a coins or country formed for freed slaves would have depicting itself. But this is what happens when you have artists who are going off script. But things can change. By the 1960s, this is what Liberia was issuing as coins. And this is, hey, this is something most Liberians can probably relate to. The depiction of the Republic. And this is a country, after all, that's named after liberty. So when I say the Republic and liberty are now being fused, this country probably epitomizes it. I want one more example I want to talk about, and this I noticed when I had noticed Haitian coins. Haiti has had a very interesting and tragic history after its independence. Now, this is a country formed from the only successful slave revolt. And these are the coins that they were issuing in the late 19th century. And again, the engraver is Oscar Roti, who was the one who engraved the SOR, the French franc coin. And the artist was Haitian, but my guess is the models, these coins are made in Paris, so the models they found were French, because the images don't particularly look Haitian. Moving on to the non-Spanish part of Latin America, Brazil was the only monarchy in Latin America. And then in 1888, Emperor Pedro II was deposed, and Brazil gets a republic. And guess what shows up on their coin? Liberty, with the Phrygian cap. And then a later series of coins, again, Liberty has lost the Phrygian coin, but has Liberty, just to make sure you know who it is on there. And his cousins in the House of Braganza continued to rule Portugal. And in 1908, you had the infamous Lisbon regicide, when King Carlos and his heir apparent were both gunned down in the streets of Lisbon. And his second son, Manuel, became the last king of Portugal. And in 1910, he was deposed. And Portugal decides to symbolize the new republic with liberty. And again, the style to me looks fairly French. It wouldn't shock me if that is where these coins were engraved and minted. The French mint was minting a lot of these coins. What I found amusing was the French then went on and issued these coins in Goa, in India. Goa, well, the Indians would consider it a colony. The Portuguese took a position like the French would take with Algeria. No. It is a province, which is a little ridiculous. And this particular motif seems a little odd to put in a colony, but that is what they did. And I found this 1917 coin, and I'm assuming this does represent the Republic and liberty, but it's a slightly different motif. Liberty is younger, more innocent. It's almost like a little girl. And I've not been able to look this up, but Portugal at this point, to gain allies, had actually joined World War One and had actually lost soldiers on the Western Front. So I wonder if this was related to that. I mentioned Britannia. Britannia, this is similar to the way Britannia shows up on Hadrian's coins. Britannia shows up either sitting or standing. On the native British coins, she often shows up on the small change, on the farthings and the shillings of this thing. The first one is a coin of Charles II. The one on the right is the trade dollar for Southeast Asia. And these are more modern issues with Elizabeth and a standing Britannia with Edward VII. Obviously, England is still a monarchy, so the monarch still personifies the nation, but you can still find places for Britannia or John Bull in the consciousness. When I did this one presentation, I knew I wanted to talk about this coin. Milda is allegedly a Lithuanian pagan deity, who may or may not have existed, may have been created as a work of romantic fiction in the 19th century. Lithuania, of course, was the last pagan country in Europe. When the nation of Latvia got independent, Milda sort of became a personification of Latvia. And the guy who engraved these coins found this proofreader who worked in the Latvian government, Zelma Brauer, who he thought personified it. So he came up with a bunch of artwork to try to put on the coin. Then he decided this was a side profile image he would use. And he came up with the image on the left, which was then sent to the Royal Mint for finishing, and which came out as this coin. And it's a pretty cool coin. It's actually fairly affordable. It shows up on eBay all the time. It's fairly easily available. And they also put Zelma on the 10 Latu note. Latvia, unfortunately, was screwed over by Hitler and Stalin. Stalin came in 1939, came in and basically shot everybody who was involved with the Latvian government. And Latvia would not become independent until the fall of the Soviet Union. And guess who they put back on their coin, paper money, and also on their €2 coin. So this particular image and personification of the nation of Latvia survives today. Spain, again, has been a monarchy for a long time, except when you had the first Spanish Republic, they used Hispania, which is basically they copied the depiction of Hispania on Hadrian's coin. And then they had a couple of coins depicting the new Spanish Republic, again in the female form. The first Spanish Republic was a disaster. They couldn't back together, so they eventually ended up first inviting an Italian prince and then the son of the monarch they had deposed to come back. And then the son of that monarch, Alfonso XIII, was kicked out, and they brought back liberty and the republic, and she looks like she has some serious steroid problems. Look at those arms. They look really unusual. And then they also had this coin, very similar to the French depictions of Marianne with the cap, the Espanola. And the last image I want to show here, the depiction of the Republic. She's called La Rubia, the blonde, because the coin was blonde and is golden in color. Polonia is generally considered the depiction of Poland. This is a famous painting from the revolt against Russian rule in the 1860s. The lady in black symbolizes Poland. The lady in white symbolizes Lithuania. Poland and Lithuania were a joint commonwealth. And after Poland re-emerged on the map of Europe after World War I, this coin came out. Now, there is considerable debate as to who this coin depicts. Often you see it as a representation of the new Poland, Polonia, and Janina Zatowska may have been the model. She was a socialite who was used as inspiration by the artist. But it could be Queen Jadwiga of Poland. Queen Jadwiga married Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania, who converted to Christianity, making Lithuania no longer the last pagan country in Europe. And she is very revered in Poland. The argument against that is that Jadwiga's depictions normally show her wearing a crown, and this depiction is not wearing a crown. So this is still up in the air whether it's the queen or whether it is a depiction of Poland. Italy is not as common. The depiction of conception of personification of Italy is this thing called Italia Turretta, which is depicted on these ancient pagan goddesses, particularly Cybele, who had in ancient coins a turreted crown, which also symbolized the walled cities of Italy. Shows up every so often. It had showed up on the coin of the Ligurian Republic. I forgot to point it out. But it didn't show up that often. It shows up on a coin of Victor Emmanuel on the reverse. And more recently, it shows up on a coin of the Italian Republic. And notice the turret on top of Italia's head. I did want to highlight this coin because this is a coin they issued to commemorate Columbus. And it frustrates me on listings because they just say it is a woman facing left. And it is particularly aggravating because who is this woman? To me, I think she pretty much represents the Republic in female form. There's no other reason why they have a woman with no name on it. It's a fairly pretty coin. It's not an uncommon coin, but most catalogers will just call it a woman, which is the same thing that happens with this coin, the next one. And I'm a little long. I'm almost done. We'll have 3 slides left after this. I tried to find depictions of Germania. As I mentioned, Domitian had a depiction of Germania. Germania shows up on medals. She doesn't often show up. I've not been able to find a depiction of Germania on coins. But this is a coin of the city-state of Frankfurt just before the unification of Germany. And again, this is one of those coins where they keep saying female bust looking right. And to me, it has to be a depiction of personification of the city of Frankfurt. Again, there's no reason really to put this bust on there. So this would be another personification of it. Switzerland was not personified by a woman for a long time. Switzerland's traditional depiction was actually a bull. But in the last couple of centuries, on coins and particularly the ubiquitous shooting medals, you have Helvetia, which is a more classical depiction of the Helvetii were a Germanic, a Celtic tribe that had invaded Italy, and then Julius Caesar had driven back into the region and became the Roman name for the province. And Helvetia has been the name of Switzerland since. And this is a more classical depiction of Helvetia seated, and then you have Helvetia standing. The Swiss Confederation is sort of unique. In some ways, it's very similar to our own Articles of Confederation, in which each canton basically gets a veto on before you pass any amendment, and it's a very, very decentralized form of government, which works also because it's such a small country. But then, other than the full profile, you also have Helvetia depicted just with the female head. And another one from the early 20th century, which I did want to put up there. If any of you are Sound of Music fans, and I know that is set in Austria, but the wreath of flowers at the neck of Helvetia is the Edelweiss. So again, you have a female personification of a country. And now the last slide over here. This is, the Romans never conquered Ireland. They called the region Hibernia. It is referred to as Hibernia. But the most common personification of Ireland often has been the Celtic harp. And well, as you all know, this is also a brand of a beer. This is a coin of Henry VIII as King of Ireland. Henry VIII elevated himself from Lord of Ireland to King of Ireland. As an aside and a bit of a digression, this coin also depicts his queens. He had coins, I think that's an I on the right, so that's for Jane Seymour. So it's a joint issue. He has also had coins of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. 3 of the 6 wives also got depicted on, mentioned on coins. But this is, the harp is a very common depiction of Ireland. But in the Georgian period, they started putting a female personification of Ireland on coins. But you cannot get away from the harp. Hibernia still is seated next to the Celtic harp. these are coins of George the First, and yeah, I think they're both George the First. There are two different denominations, and even I confirmed this with an Irish friend. Hibernia is not a particular personification of Ireland. There are other motifs in the harp which are more common, except two recent commemorative coins of Ireland do use Hibernia on them. These two were issued in 2016 to commemorate the centenary of the Easter Rising in 1916, which eventually kicked off the Irish War of Independence and the creation of Ireland, at least the Republic of Ireland as the Irish Free State, and later the Republic of Ireland. And this personification of Hibernia actually is on top of the post office, which was one of the sites of the fighting. And so the Irish government did issue these coins. But again, it's not a very common motif, but I wanted to give the Irish their due. Obviously, these are probably more coins than any of you have seen in one single presentation. And having said that, I did a survey and know there are areas. Every time I've done this presentation, I keep adding a slide, and which is why this has been a really long presentation. So thank you for bearing with me. But these personifications of women as a state are fairly interesting. Conceptually, a lot of ancient cities had this concept of the mother goddess, and women are the ones who bear fruit. So it kind of makes sense, but this is not uniform. There are plenty of countries where the personification is male, and evidently a little bit of reading, the more recent representations are often male. But it is a very cool subset to see how these countries depicted them. A lot of the modern depictions are still following the classical motifs from the Roman period. You have the same concepts of the liberty cap. You have if you have a standing liberty image, you will have, you used to have a cornucopia. Now, some of those are not as common because you have the side profile bust in there, but modern coinage borrows so much from our ancient inspirations. And so it is kind of cool to see when it gets redepicted again. So I know I've taken a long time, so thank you everybody. And that's it from me. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Well, thank you, Deven. It was a perfect presentation, good length, and a great topic. So no need to apologize for that. Anybody have any questions?
This is Harold. I have one question. First off, great presentation, absolutely wonderful. What regions and for what reasons do you not see libertas or female representation on coinage? Like one that sort of stood out, and I just want to see if this is correct, is Scandinavian countries.
So so Scandinavia, again, it's interesting because, well, they're all monarchies except for Finland, and I didn't dig into Finnish coinage to see their examples. So the monarch often is going to represent the state. So for whatever reason, now they do depict, there was this concept of Scandinavianism in the 19th century when Norway, Sweden, Denmark were sort of romantically aligned with each other. So it shows up in art, but it doesn't always show up in coins. It doesn't show up in coins because you still have the monarch showing up on the coins. Like it is depicted in other art form, but it won't always depict itself in coins.
Thank you.
Well, just to comment on that, Sweden actually has a number of coins and medals with female representation on it. They had, I believe, the earliest chief of mint that was a woman for a country in history. Her name was Leah Alborn. She took over the mint in about 1830 or 1835. And she even created a medal for her own wedding that depicts a woman flying through the air with wings. But anyway, she actually did probably well over 500 medals in her life, plus all the coins from the 1870s. So if you ever take a look at Leah Alborn, you'll see a lot of them.
Yeah, so medals, like as I said, there are countries like Germania shows up a lot on medals, but not on coins. And medals are then, this would be a 2-hour presentation if I got to do that.
Okay. Any other questions?
One other question. So you mentioned India and how Portuguese Goa, had the female representation. What about the other European nations like French India? What about British Pondicherry?
That's a good one. French India, actually, the paper money does have it because actually the French India paper money basically copied what they had in Southeast Asia, and instead of 5 piastres, they just said 5 rupees. And if you ever get that note, it's like it'll cost you like $5,000 to get it. But on coinage, like I didn't dig too deep into it. Some of the early coins actually had the fleur-de-lis on it. That is a very common coin. It shows up every so often, the fanon. And they had other depictions of France on it. And I will confess, I didn't dig too deep on it, but I don't believe, if they may have had some with Marianne, like they did. And I think French India probably referred to Indochina, because Indochina was by then the more important colony. The British are interesting because they initially tried their own coinage, and then for a while they basically copied the coinage of the Mughal emperors, because the Mughal emperor gave them the license. Technically, they were ruling on his behalf until 1835. East India Company ends the fiction and starts putting the king on the coins. William IV suddenly shows up on the coins. So the British really didn't do this. The Dutch and the Danes had their coins, but you typically did not have human images on the coins. The Dutch they were not there for too long. They sold off very quickly. So there aren't a whole lot. And the Portuguese had a series of coins where the queen and the monarch shows up on the coins too, until 1910.
Thank you.
Okay.
So the Norway has one coin, the watch on the border during the separation from Sweden, depicts Mother Norway standing and looking out to sea on the reverse of the coin.
There we go.
That's the only representation.
Next time I do this, one more slide to add. Well, and that may have also been ironically in the period where they didn't have a monarch yet, because when the Union broke up, a lot of people wanted a republic, but they realized a monarchy might get them allies. And so they picked the younger son of the King of Denmark, or the grandson, whose wife just happened to be the daughter of the King of the United Kingdom, Edward VII.
Yeah.
So that would tie them to the UK. And then he insisted they have a referendum, and he was elected king by a referendum. And then they have had a king ever since. So.
Yes, indeed. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Hi, Dan. Don.
Deven, very interesting, fascinating. Thank you very much. I'm a little bit confused. I thought you had said that there is a difference between the Phrygian hat and the Liberty cap, yet I heard you kind of use the term interchangeably. So can you tell me, what was the first cap that was used to represent liberty? Because I thought it was called the Phrygian cap, and I thought that was the cap they gave to gladiators when they earned their freedom. So please correct my thoughts and clarify that, please.
Sure, not a problem. So, and actually I will just pull up the slide where I talked about that. Right here. So the cap that was actually used was the one called the Pileus, Pileus. And if you notice on the first coins that we have with Lady Liberty on it, behind her head, it doesn't look like the Phrygian cap. It looks more like the Eidmar coin of Brutus, and like the Liberty coin that I showed earlier. And I'll pull that one up too, so you can see the reverse of that. Look at the reverse of this particular cap and how this looks like our Liberty. It's very similar. So that was actually the coin, the cap that was used, the Pileus. But what seems to have happened is during the French Revolution, people got confused. And then they started associating the Phrygian cap with liberty. So like even American coinage is still using the pileus in its first depictions of a liberty cap. And then the French in the Age of Revolution start doing this and have a totally different cap, and that gets associated with liberty. And it's still a matter of debate why exactly that happened, as what drove it up. And so today, when people say the liberty cap, they associate it with the Phrygian cap.
Right.
But that is something that people got muddled up in the 1790s. And so by the time the United States starts putting it on art coinage again, by the 1830s, we are using the Phrygian cap.
But our original Liberty caps was the Phileas cap, correct? And
Yes.
the Phileas
Yes.
cap was the same cap they gave to gladiators? And was that the origin
Yes, or to freed slaves. Yeah.
of the freed slaves?
Yeah, because gladiators didn't obviously, but not always slaves. Most of them were, but not always. But yeah.
And that was the symbol that they were free.
Yeah, and if you look at the coin of Brutus, the Aidmar denarius in the middle,
Yeah.
that cap symbolizes liberty. That's why it's there.
Thank
Deven, were those caps colored red? Am I remembering that correctly?
To be honest, for the pileus, I don't know. I don't remember because obviously in the coins we won't know. I'm not sure of that. The French often may have, but red, because then they started coloring in the color of the tricolor as well. So.
Thank you, Deven. A little background, I heard Deven give this talk for the online coin club, and I immediately knew that the members of the Pacific Coast Numismatic Society would enjoy it, and indeed we have. So thank you
Indeed.
so much, Deven.
Indeed. Thank you.
Welcome.
Wonderful.
I'll stop the recording.